I never thought my own son would hit me. And yet, here I was, sitting on the edge of the couch, my hands shaking, a towel clutched tightly in my lap. You might think I'm exaggerating, but this all started with something as harmless as folding towels. Just towels. The kind of mundane task you do every week without a second thought. And yet, that simple act became the trigger for a nightmare I never saw coming. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. It happened one quiet Saturday morning. I was in my kitchen, humming softly to myself, neatly folding the stack of towels from the dryer. I always fold them the same way, lengthwise, small neat rectangles, everything in its place. My son, David, 38, corporate executive, perfectionist, always on edge, walked in. He looked at the towels, his expression tightening. "Mom, what is this?" he said, his voice calm but sharp underneath. "These are folded all wrong." I froze. All wrong? How could towels ever be wrong? But before I could respond, his temper flared, and in a moment of rage I'll never forget, he shoved me. I stumbled back, hitting the edge of the counter. It wasn't just anger, it was fury, a sudden storm that seemed to explode out of nowhere. My mind raced. Why was this happening? How could something so trivial spiral into violence? And that's when I realized, this wasn't just about towels. This was about control. About frustration he carried from his job, his life, the stress he never admitted. And somehow, that morning, I became the target. My body still aches when I remember the force, but worse was the betrayal, the disbelief that your own child could turn on you in such a way. I tried to reason, tried to calm him down, but David doesn't do calm well. And by the time he stormed out, I was left holding a towel like it was some kind of shield, staring at the stack I'd so carefully folded. That's when he said something that would haunt me. "Tomorrow, cover your face and smile. My wife's boss is coming for dinner." I didn't understand what he meant at the time. I had no idea that the events of that dinner, and what would follow at his workplace, would expose truths I had never expected. The tension was already building like a storm cloud on the horizon, and I had a front row seat. I couldn't have known that by the next morning, David would walk into a boardroom and turn as pale as chalk. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It started with towels, but it ended with bruises. I still remember the moment vividly, as if it were etched into my memory with fire. I had been folding them carefully, lining each one like soldiers on parade. David walked in, his eyes immediately locking onto the stack. The calm in his voice at first was almost worse than shouting. "Mom, what is this?" he asked, pointing at the towels. "This is all wrong." I laughed nervously. "Wrong?" "David, it's just towels," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But I could see the storm brewing behind his eyes. There's a strange thing about anger, it can hit you faster than you anticipate, and it always comes with disbelief. I should have walked away. I should have left the towels alone. But I didn't. I wanted to reason with him, to tell him this was ridiculous. That's when it escalated. His hand shot out, shoving me backward. I stumbled against the kitchen counter, the edge pressing painfully into my hip. I grabbed at the counter, trying to steady myself, and in that instant, I saw a side of my son I had never seen before, a raw, explosive fury that was terrifying in its intensity. I froze, my heart pounding, every instinct screaming that I needed to get out of his way. David's face was red, almost distorted, and his words came faster now. "Why can't you do anything right?" he shouted. I tried to speak, but my voice trembled. "I folded them the way I always do," I whispered. He didn't care. He couldn't hear reason. I realized then that this was more than a fight about towels, it was about control, about his frustrations from work and life spilling into my home, onto me. I braced myself as he approached again, and instinctively raised my hands, but it was too late. There was a sharp shove that knocked the wind out of me. I could feel bruises forming already, my pride stinging worse than the physical pain. And then, in a moment that froze me in shock, he whispered, almost calmly now, tomorrow, cover your face and smile. My wife's boss is coming for dinner. I wanted to ask what he meant. I wanted to understand. But the words hung in the air like a warning I couldn't decipher yet. I spent the rest of the evening trying to make sense of it, cleaning up the towels, trying to act normal, all while my body ached and my mind raced. And in that quiet, when I thought I could finally breathe, I realized, this was only the beginning. What came next would push me into a situation I never imagined, a situation that would change the way I saw my son forever. I thought the nightmare was over after the towel incident. I thought, maybe, if I just smiled and said nothing, the storm would pass. But that evening, David's instructions from the morning echoed in my mind, cover your face and smile. My wife's boss is coming for dinner. At first, I didn't understand. Cover my face? Smile? What kind of dinner was this going to be? The doorbell rang, and my heart skipped a beat. Sarah's boss arrived, a tall, sharp woman named Evelyn, impeccably dressed, with eyes that seemed to miss nothing. David greeted her with a forced cheerfulness, shaking hands and making small talk that sounded practiced, almost rehearsed. I moved quietly into the kitchen, putting on a smile that felt like a mask, trying not to show the bruises forming on my arms from earlier. Every step I took felt heavy, every breath calculated. I poured drinks, set plates, and followed David's exact instructions. Smile. Nod. Pretend nothing happened. The irony of it all was bitter. My son had been the source of violence that morning, and now he was asking me to act like everything was perfectly fine in front of his boss. I couldn't help but think, silently, that the absurdity of it might have been funny if I weren't still nursing sore muscles. The dinner began, laughter and polite chatter filling the room. I noticed David's hands trembling slightly as he passed the bread, the tension barely masked by his usual confident facade. I caught him glancing at his phone every few seconds, a flicker of worry crossing his face that didn't belong to the polished executive everyone at work admired. Something was off, and I could feel it. He was hiding something, and I didn't know what. I moved around, keeping my smile steady, nodding along with Evelyn's stories, all while listening carefully to David's responses. The room smelled of roasted chicken and rich gravy, but I could sense the underlying anxiety like a shadow in the air. He was trying so hard to appear normal, to control the narrative, but the cracks were showing, subtle but undeniable. And then, just as I thought I might survive the evening without a scene, David whispered to me from across the table, barely audible. Mom, don't let them see anything. His eyes darted around the room, and I understood, this wasn't just about appearances. Something much bigger was at stake, something he feared more than anyone knowing about the earlier confrontation. I nodded, my smile tightening. Little did he know, what he had tried to hide tonight would surface tomorrow, and when it did, it would leave him pale, vulnerable, and completely exposed. What David didn't realize yet was that his secret wasn't safe anymore. And what happened the next morning at his office would change everything. The next morning, I woke before the sun. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, and the memory of the dinner weighed heavily on me. David had left early, already dressed in his crisp suit, briefcase in hand, pretending that last night hadn't happened. But I knew better. I could sense the storm brewing inside him, the same storm that had erupted over towels just a day before. At 8:30, I received a short text from David. Mom, keep your phone nearby. You won't believe what's happening at work. My curiosity piqued, but I knew better than to reply. Whatever he was about to face, he was completely unprepared. I imagined him walking into the boardroom, expecting a normal meeting with the executives, all smiles and polished professionalism. But life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. David had been hiding something from his team, something that could not withstand scrutiny. What he didn't realize was that my actions during dinner, subtle, almost invisible, had shifted the balance. A misfiled report, an offhand comment he had made in passing, something small but damning, had now become the focal point of the morning meeting. When he entered the boardroom, I imagined him straightening his tie, forcing a confident smile, nodding at colleagues. But as he glanced at the documents in front of him, the color drained from his face. Pale. Chalk-like. His hands trembled as he tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Everyone in the room looked up, sensing the sudden change in his demeanor. The confident executive they admired was suddenly faltering, unsteady, vulnerable in a way no one had ever seen. And that's when the fallout began. Questions flew, documents were passed around, and I knew from my vantage point at home that this was bigger than David could handle. The panic, the realization that everything he had tried to hide was now exposed, must have been overwhelming. I could almost see the fear in his eyes, the same eyes that had terrified me just a day before. Meanwhile, at home, I poured myself a cup of tea, my hands still shaking slightly from the tension of the past 24 hours. I couldn't help but think about the irony, how towels, something so insignificant, had set off a chain of events that led to his public unraveling. And then, my phone buzzed again. A single message from David: "Mom. I don't know how to fix this. They know everything." I took a slow sip of tea, letting the weight of those words sink in. The boy who had beaten me over towels was now completely exposed, powerless, and perhaps, for the first time, truly afraid. By the time I sat down that evening, the events of the last 48 hours finally began to settle in. David's office had turned into a battlefield he never anticipated. His mistakes, the little deceptions he thought were invisible, had all come to light. The boardroom, once his arena of control and authority, had become a place of exposure and vulnerability. And through it all, I realized something profound: sometimes the smallest acts, the tiniest interventions, can set off consequences no one expects. I reflected on the fight over towels, the bruises on my arms, the fear that had gripped me in my own home. It had felt humiliating, terrifying, even surreal. But in hindsight, that small, seemingly trivial conflict had been a signal. A storm warning. And in surviving it, I discovered a strength I hadn't fully acknowledged in myself. I had not sought revenge or humiliation, I had simply acted cautiously, observed quietly, and in doing so, the truth came to light in its own way. David, once so towering in his confidence and anger, had learned something he couldn't have learned any other way. The boy who had beaten me over towels had now been humbled. Not by me directly, but by the consequences of his own choices. And as I thought about that, a strange mixture of satisfaction and sorrow filled me. Satisfaction that justice, of a kind, had been served. Sorrow that it had taken violence and deception to reach that point. I looked at the towels stacked neatly in the laundry room. I folded one, deliberately wrong, just to remind myself of how fragile appearances and control can be. Life is unpredictable, I realized. Even a simple household chore can ripple outward in ways that shock you. And in those ripples, sometimes the person you least expect, the one you thought was in control, finds themselves vulnerable and exposed. If there's one lesson from this story, it's that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it's quiet. Sometimes, it's watching, waiting, and knowing when to act. And sometimes, it's surviving the storm your own child brings into your life. So, I ask you. Have you ever faced someone you love turning violent or unreasonable over something that seems insignificant? How did you respond? The smallest acts you take, the tiniest interventions, may change the course of events in ways you could never imagine. If this story shocked you, made you think, or even made you shiver a little, share it in the comments. Tell me your story. And for more unbelievable real-life family dramas like this one, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because sometimes the most ordinary moments hide the most extraordinary consequences.